Welcome to Coffee and Contemplation. I'm Robin, and today we'll be discussing Chapter 2, Trick or Treat, Freak. Today's coffee is a little bit less glamorous, but I'm enjoying it quite a lot. It is the maple bourbon flavored coffee from Good & Gather, the Target brand. I was there shopping for Halloween decorations and saw their coffee selection, and I thought, maple bourbon, that sounds amazing. So I grabbed some and I'm trying it, and it's delightful. A lot of times flavored coffee like this can be a bit of a hit or miss. It can be too strong, or it can be just just too much, or it barely has any flavor at all. And I'm happy to report that this is a really nice, happy medium. Although ironically, it's a light roast, a blonde roast, as opposed to a medium roast, which is my preference. So if I'm a little bit overly chatty in today's episode, that's probably why. And I'm drinking it also from a newly acquired fall-themed mug. I got 2 new mugs recently. Today's is one that says Witch's Brew on it, and now that I have coffee, let's proceed with contemplation. The end of chapter 1 leaves you with all these questions of like, well, okay, so 11 is alive, how, even if you theorize that she was still alive, how is she still alive, and how did she end up here with Hopper? So chapter 2 gets right down to business. It just cuts directly to, okay, here's what happened. You would see this tool, this approach in a film. I mean, you could essentially remove the chapter break and it would function just as smoothly. I mean, you could go right from the end of chapter 1 immediately to the beginning of chapter 2, just a cut to black and go right into it. And yet it works really well in episodic format. Part of that being the fact that we don't actually get the entire story here. They use this tool to bridge the gap, but they don't necessarily... I mean, in a film, you could also stretch out the flashbacks, but I think that they do that really, really effectively, and I think that's what makes it feel less completely like a film. I mean, I don't know how this would have hit during more of the broadcast, appointment television age, if someone deliberately chose to only watch one episode per week. I don't know, but as we've said before, it makes for this really seamless binging experience. The truth is, they don't really explain how 11 survived. It's more a question of, yep, she did, and we're moving on. And not only that, but you don't even see necessarily how if the Demogorgon survived. Is it dead? That was the impression that I certainly got. In this context, it doesn't matter. Our interest is 11. Is she okay? Okay, she seems to be alone. The Demogorgon's not there. Cool. And we're able to just move along into the episode. Again, kind of wishing that maybe here we could have heard her call out for the others as well. That said, I mean, in a way, it does kind of set up Lucas and Dustin are not in the same emotional place as Mike or 11. I just think, maybe one or two, one occasion when she calls out for the others' names, I think it would have benefited everyone. And that's the first of 2 occasions in this episode where I think Lucas and Dustin get a little bit short shrift. In these early scenes, though, where she's wandering around the halls, calling out for Mike, trying to find her way out of the upside down, the crack in the wall and the gate, essentially. I love the setup of this, laying the groundwork for the fact that Elle can manipulate a gate. It's not surprising necessarily. I mean, we already saw that she was able to basically, if not kill the Demogorgon, she was certainly able to do it some damage. So to some degree, she has power over these upside down elements. Until this rewatch, it had never really occurred to me that this is set up. Much later, I believe in chapter 9, she tells Hopper she can close the gate. She knows that she can. That's not just her assuming anything. It's because she's done it before. I like that we as an audience got to see it. And even if some of us missed it the first time around. She gets out, she goes to the Wheeler residence, which is, of course, swarmed by all the lab goons and by all these vehicles. It's kind of impressive that 11 doesn't get caught here. There are a couple of really long oneers. I don't know, there might be a cut hidden in some of these sequences, but it's presented as if it's a oneer or one long continuous shot. We move through the house, and when we kind of come to rest on Mike, not actually unlike that sequence in the junkyard that preceded the fight between Lucas and 11. It's not an uncommon tool, but I think that it may be a specific visual style of Stranger Things, kind of a signature thing about it is they're really impressive long sequences, very smooth moving things that then come and settle. I think Stranger Things implements it really well. And it also doesn't do it so often that it's overwhelmingly obvious. But thinking of like moments like that, we move past these conversations very quickly. And the scene itself is really, really wonderful to watch. I mean, it's terrible because it's upsetting. I mean, the look between Mike and 11 through the window is just heartbreaking. Almost eye contact. 11 has to run and she is back to hiding in the woods and just trying to survive. It's not a complete hard reset because the stakes are different, but it's just effectively taking her right back to where she was at the beginning of season 1. It's really, really sad to think about it in that context. That's when we get our title sequence. After which we come out of that and she's a ghost and she wants to go trick-or-treating. I love the fact that she's a ghost and Mike is a Ghostbuster. I mean, all the boys are. Now, we don't know. I mean, I had always taken it as a thing of like, well, she does, they don't know. So they're like connected on some other level, or maybe it's just a fun little thing that they threw in there. At the same time, there's also this possibility that maybe because she's been checking in on Mike and he's been calling out to her on the walkie-talkie, maybe he has mentioned that they're planning to go as the Ghostbusters, and maybe that's even where she got the idea from. However you slice it, it's cute, it's adorable, and I love it. Hopper says no, though, to the trick-or-treating, and this is the first moment where I started to go, okay, so she's still essentially caged in. I'm inclined to agree with Elle. She would be hidden under the sheet. I think it probably would be okay. That's when Hopper presents the idea of, look, I'll come home early, I'll get some candy, compromise, halfway happy. I think the idea of compromise and the whole halfway happy thing ends up being an interesting thematic element to the entire season. He promises, and that one's not going to come back to bite you later, is it, Hop? We get this almost verbatim walkthrough of the early scene in season 1 where they first realized that Will was missing. The beats, the shots, everything. It's very similar. It's a nice way to show, I think, kind of what they're kind of dealing with on a day-to-day basis. Also establish like how much it kind of wears on Will. He manages to convey a lot of that emotion without like laying blame. But then Joyce helps Will into his Ghostbusters costume and with the proton pack, and then that's when she finds the drawing of the mind flayer, which he does lie about this time. And then cut to our Ghostbusters montage. It's so great. I love too how much we're actually getting narratively in this sequence. What they're like with their moms. Dustin with his mom, and then we get Mike with Karen. Our first real interaction with Erica here. These kids take pride in their Halloween costumes. It's great. I mean, as a cosplayer, of course I appreciate that. And then of course it concludes with them all arriving at school, the argument about over who Venkman is. It makes sense to me why at the time they would both want to be Venkman, but I mean, honestly, Egon is my favorite of the original Ghostbusters. However, no one else at school is wearing costumes. I don't know about any of you, but Halloween was always the thing at my school. There was always definitely a day devoted to costumes and Halloween activities, even if Halloween didn't fall on a weekday. And I don't remember it ever being like uncool to dress up for Halloween. I don't remember there being that shift. I think maybe some kids didn't do it in middle school, but primarily it was still a thing. Most kids liked to do it. And also those costumes rock. All of them, even though they're all a little bit different because they didn't make them unanimously, which I actually really, really appreciate. I mean, they blend. They're clearly all the Ghostbusters, and there's some details that are similar, but you can tell they were made by different people. So shout out to the costume designer for this episode, Kim Wilcox. If I was there, though, I would have been like, hey, why don't you guys ask Mr. Clark if you can stash at least the proton packs in the AV Club room until the end of the day, so at least that part's not as noticeable. Maybe they couldn't get to the AV Club room, I don't know, because they definitely wouldn't fit in their lockers, but I stand by it. Those costumes rock. Dustin and Lucas see Max in the hallway. Really beautiful music track through this whole sequence. I believe it's called Presumptuous, even though that conversation doesn't happen until a few scenes later. That's when we catch up with Joyce and Hopper, and she is showing Hopper the drawing of the mind flayer that Will drew, and they're comparing it to the space outside. I don't get it. Why would he lie? Well, he's a kid, Joyce. And they don't linger on that, but I found that kind of curious based on our conversation last time. She and Will are really close and how it is more in Will's nature to talk to her. Like, I don't think Hopper is being cruel or anything. I think normally that would be a acceptable response, and to some degree it even is. Like, maybe this is just, he's just kind of being a kid in this moment, but he's not, and Joyce is aware of that. And at this point, a lot of it's just because he's scared. They proceed to talk about what Will is experiencing, and that's when Hopper says, these aren't episodes, they're flashbacks. I've known guys that have, gone through stuff like this, and I think that Owens is right. It made me wonder, are these experiences that he's had, or, is he talking about his own PTSD from Vietnam? Quite possibly. I think I headcanon that Hopper is speaking to some of his own experience, if not like all of it, and that he probably does know other people, other guys that he served with, possibly who are experienced, who have talked about or at least implied this. It was a nice layering for Hopper as a character. He also does say, we're all on edge. We just kind of have to get through it. It's a nice touch. They reminisce about their high school days. You could definitely get some romantic undertones here, particularly on Hopper's side. That sort of gives way to Joyce saying, I just want all this to be over. Hopper's reaction to that, I'd never really paid too much attention to it before, but in this rewatch, I wondered what he's sort of going through when she says that. He doesn't want her to be suffering. He doesn't want Will to be suffering. He doesn't. So in some ways, he wants it to be over too. But I also think that he may be wrestling with the fact that because all of this is happening, he's getting to spend all this time with Joyce, and he's getting to be in her life, and he's not only that, he's actually able to be there, an emotional support for her, even if they're not a couple, they're not romantically involved. She has Bob, but she can't tell Bob everything. He doesn't have the shared trauma. Hopper's able to be there for Will, and he's able to go with them to the lab, and he's able to, just by his own involvement with the lab, is able to be looking out for them, in addition to looking out for the town. Again, he doesn't want her to suffer, though. I think he's probably really wrestling with that, because he knows that, if all this is over, their relationship will probably change. They may not see each other much after that. He doesn't want to let go of that. And I feel like that's completely relatable, completely understandable. A lot of his reaction conveys so much of that kind of turbulence. Over at the lab, they're doing a field walk to repair some sort of antenna. In yet another tremendous contrast to Brenner, we have Owens in civvies. He's wearing normal, regular clothes. But they're also making progress. From a post-season 3 perspective, I actually find that encouraging. As we discussed last season, for sure, this idea of, is the Upside Down sentient? Is it going to ever be one overarching antagonist? Especially now that I think it's safe to say we're done with the Mind Flayer. I mean, they may be bringing the Demogorgon back, but the Upside Down is still there. I don't know that we can just leave it there, can we? It's a problem that needs to be dealt with on some level. I get the impression that that's what Owens is actually trying to do. Point is no longer we got to figure out ways to spy on the Russians. The point is no longer we got to figure out how to turn kids into super soldiers or, with powers. Like, seeing this moment kind of encapsulates that a little bit to me. Them working together as a team to continue to try to get what information they can from the Upside Down. The ethics and morals behind that is questionable. And at that point, we swing over to Hawkins High, and we catch up with Nancy and Steve, who are studying in the library. Nancy goes over to the pencil sharpener, where she looks over and happens to see a girl who resembles Barb. I actually really, really like the use of the audio flashback here. I kind of wish that they did that more often. We don't see Barb at all. It keeps us grounded in Nancy's head. I think it keeps us grounded in that moment of like what she's feeling in that space in the library. And that's when they go into a side room to talk, because no, Nancy is not okay. She can't pretend like everything's okay. It's weighing on her. In episode 1, there was a question as to whether or not Steve was supposed to have known everything, because he wasn't there for the bathtub sequence. So, is that why he's a little obtuse in the dinner scene with the Hollands? But here, this scene basically conveys like, no, he clearly does know, because nothing that she says surprises him. which really bums me out in a lot of ways, because, you know, him saying like, oh, that's great, you know, to the Hollands, now it feels like a deliberate attempt to make him look obtuse, and I don't think it was necessary. I think maybe like if it had been more of a like, that's great, like if it had been more of an awkward like, I don't really know what to say, and maybe that's what they were going for and it just didn't quite work. But I still don't like it. Steve says, let's go to the party tonight and just wear our costumes that we've been working on for too long and just be stupid teenagers just for tonight, which feels like a callback to season 1 when he said like, let's just go see a movie and let's just like pretend like everything's okay for a few hours. On my first watch, I was 100% so frustrated with Steve's response. I was like, you just don't get it. You don't understand. You are being callous. You're being cowardly because you're trying to just ignore the problem, and very resentful, like even more, I think, angry than Nancy is in this scene. Watching it now, they both are actually coming from really understandable places. This is the beginning of the end for them. And I mean, it's a very quick descent, but especially because it's not going down in flames just yet. They both really need very different things. I think the way that they walk that line, the way the writing walks that line, and then the way they perform it is just really beautifully done. There's a lot that they both gain from their breakup, the fact that they both grow and change in really wonderful ways separately. But I really believe that they still very much care about each other. Like, their cast is enormous. I know you can't get everything, but something I would really love to see would be to see at least a little bit of one-on-one interaction between Steve and Nancy as they are now, because the truth is, they don't really interact that much in this season, and they don't really at all in season 3. But it's just something I would really love to see them explore a little bit, is like, what would they be like as exes? Kiri and Dyer work really well off of each other, and I would like to see what they would do with that dynamic now that they're not a romantic couple. What is that relationship dynamic? Are they friends? Can they be friends? I don't know. Lucas and Dustin finally do approach Max, and it's adorable. In spite of the obvious love triangle aspect that they're setting up here, just that kind of being super into something that one finds really, really interesting and really cool, and wanting to share that with someone else. That kind of almost takes over kind of where Dustin's coming from in this scene, until he does that, no, we're not in it, okay. And like, I've definitely done that before. I think a lot of us probably have. 11, meanwhile, watches TV, and very much in the same sort of style and structure as last season, we see a flashback triggered by her seeing something that parallels to something from the flashback. We see this hunter. We never find out what this guy's deal was, if this really was just some guy, or if this was a lab guy. I mean, he has a similar vibe to, I think, Agent Fraser from last season, like when she showed up and talked to Mr. Clark. Like, it's very possible that he was a lab dude. Did he actually mean her any harm? You totally don't blame 11 for, at least I don't blame 11 for not taking the chance. But definitely don't blame her for taking his clothes, because she needs them more than he does, that's for sure. I think it's interesting too, though, that she doesn't take the gun. Back in the present, we see Hopper arrive at the police station, and he, before he goes in, he sees the truck full of rotted pumpkins. He's aware of the situation before he talks to Eugene. It kind of lays the groundwork, no pun intended, for him putting it all together and kind of starting to process it before he gets all wrapped up in the small town drama of it all. Kind of like what I was saying about the Upside Down. In one night, whatever did this took out 5 farms worth of crops. If Hawkins had been left to just continue in this way, if they hadn't addressed the Mind Flayer, if they hadn't addressed the Demodogs, how quickly would it have spread outside of this one town, outside of Indiana and beyond? I don't know that we need to see that in any of these subsequent seasons. I mean, I kind of like getting the glimpse of places outside of Hawkins. We'll get there when we get there. But seeing it here, I think Hopper is thinking that as well. Like, that's 5 farms worth. Also, shout out to Al Mitchell, who plays Eugene in this scene. Yet another example of solid performance in this, like, very, very small role. Back over at the schools, though, we see Max catch up with Billy, and we get the first scene of dialogue with him. But it was kind of a surprise to realize, oh yeah, he doesn't even speak until this moment, when he chastises her for being late and threatens to leave her stranded there. Very quick characterization work happening there. And then we get the scene of them in the car on the way home. Billy complaining, somewhat out of the blue, about Hawkins. which leads to their argument over whose fault is it that they're in Hawkins in the first place. In Runaway Max, there's an explanation that's offered, and I guess technically that's canon because it's from Netflix, from Stranger Things official. When I saw this the first time, my impression had been that it, based on the way this scene is presented, that it was Billy's. After having seen the whole thing and watching it a second time, that they're talking about Neil. Like, Billy stood up to Neil, and that's, or something, or didn't stand up to Neil, or something like that, but that Billy blames Neil, and that she blames him. She blames Billy. I'll save the rest of my theory for as we get further into the season, but a lot of it kind of comes back to this. This scene is very dense in terms of its character work that it does. I know I say that a lot. I would even say this is another one of those scenes where like everything is working so super synergistically and super well together. It's a different kind of stakes, but you feel the threat of that car coming up on those three kids. And yet, like, there's no supernatural monster there. It's there isn't even anything with the lab happening in this scene. It's just guy is about to run over three kids with his car. It's little moments like this that I think make this show really, really sing, and it's part of what I love about it so much. Harbor drives out to Eugene's pumpkin patch, and they start tracking the rot. Bob is all dressed up for Halloween, and he shows Jonathan how to use the video camera, which on this viewing I was really kind of touched by that, because it seems like Bob is aware that Jonathan is into photography, so he's kind of like, here's the, and it's in this kind of subtle way of just, so here's how it works, and, and you can take it with you. And I mean, I don't know, did Jonathan express interest, because Bob works at Radio Shack, so is it a thing of like, hey, you might be interested in videography as well as photography? Like, it seemed like a subtle way of Bob being aware of what Jonathan is interested in and trying to, connect with him, but on a very like practical level. But Jonathan doesn't seem to be feeling that, I guess, because, as he says in the next scene to Will, I don't know what she sees in him. Will's response, though, is really cool, considering that he says, like, but at least he doesn't treat me differently. We've already had the conversation between them about, everyone treating him like a baby and treating him like he's going to break and like he's fragile. But what I thought was kind of cool about this, I was reminded of the fact that Will was already an outsider in the beginning of season 1. Joyce's whole thing, his friends make fun of his clothes, So the fact that Will is already dealing with this doubled down feeling of ostracism, it really does make sense why he'd be like, but Bob at least treats me like a normal person. And it's like, I wonder to some degree if that's an echo of what Joyce is feeling. Like, she, I think, which we see a little bit of that in a scene coming up between her and Bob, like it allows her to feel like things are normal. And of course, Will's face when Jonathan lets him go alone is just, it's precious. And so Jonathan lets Will go off, and he decides to go to the Halloween party. We see that Billy is gaining popularity fast. He's already fallen in with Tommy, of all people, and who is, of course, dressed like one of the guys from Cobra Kai. That opening shot, like, that is all pretty much this entire sequence. Not when Jonathan gets there, but getting into, going from the keg to following Billy and Tommy, like, up into the house, up to where they run into Nancy and Steve, and then Nancy going over to the punch bowl, Steve catching up with her, them starting to bicker, her walking away. All of that is one shot. It really is quite impressive. I like, though, that after this sort of like what you think is going to be like some big confrontation between Billy and Steve and kind of Tommy at the same time, because, we've got a new keg, King Harrington. It looks like a standoff, but then Nancy walks away and Steve follows her like pretty quickly. So looking no worse for wear. I kind of find that interesting. Like, Steve clearly didn't engage, at least not to any significant degree. Instead, he followed her. This, of course, though, is when Nancy says the thing about, aren't we supposed to just be stupid teenagers? And walks away from him again. His posture in that moment makes me think that he's kind of like, well, shit, that didn't work. When Jonathan gets there, he sees them dancing together. They look like they're both having a good time. They're together. They look like they're having fun. That seems at odds with what we're seeing in this moment. And so it kind of makes me wonder if there's a little bit of an unreliable narrator thing happening. These two sequences happening in the order that they happen. I think in my head, I always kind of flip them. But them looking like they're having a great time, dancing together, and then this moment at the punch bowl, the first one, they feel backwards. Jonathan is seeing not so much what he wants to, but maybe what he expects to, or that's just how he's interpreting what he's witnessing before we then later see the fight between Nancy and Steve. And then this is when we get the scene between Bob and Joyce where they dance, and he says we could leave Hawkins, we could be a normal family. I think the ending of season 3 of her leaving Hawkins feels like a bookend to this moment. Season 3 doesn't intentionally make a connection like that, not as far as I remember, but the two feel linked. This moment where they dance together, she doesn't fully relax until he makes that offer. In spite of everything that happens, all of the tragedy around the character of Bob, I still really love this moment. I still think it's really beautiful and really sad because of the possibility it contains. The kids are off trick-or-treating. Max joins them by jumping out and scaring them. Dustin and Lucas are very happy about this. Mike, not so much. Well into the night, though, Hopper is still tracking the rot, and we get another instance of this sound design, this like creeping kind of like almost word-like sound that we start to associate with the Upside Down and eventually the Demodog specifically, but it's this like literally almost creeping sound, and it will show up a lot after this. And then that's when he's hearing this is when he gets spooked by the cowgirl and her fake pistol. At which point he realizes, oh crap, I am so late. He sends the signal to Elle, who receives it and is launched into another flashback where we see her finding the care package that he left for her. And I found myself wondering what prompted him to start doing that. The only thing I could come up with on my own was the idea that perhaps the guy who was in the woods, who she did steal the coat and the hat from, if that was a lab dude and he didn't die, if Elle didn't actually kill him, which I don't think she necessarily did. I think she just knocked him out. Then he went back to the lab. He talked about finding her, and Hopper heard, and Hopper caught wind of it because he's at the lab a lot and he's talking with Owen. So there may be something else happening that I'm just not aware of, that I'm just being obtuse about, but that was the only thing I could theorize and come up with. Back over at trick-or-treating, and this was great. They have the interaction about rich people and, well, where does Max live? And she says, I live on Old Cherry Road. And this was another really great, sneaky way of getting in some exposition that creates believability later, because she says she lives on this road, and that is how Lucas is able to find where she lives, because Lucas knows knows Billy's car, and he knows the road that she lives on. Because in the moment, you're not thinking about that, and yet it sets up all this stuff that will make Lucas's finding her house later completely plausible. And I know Mike is being, to use Wolfhard and Brown's term, very emo. This is emo Mike at this point in the series. I also kind of get it, and I continue to see a lot of Mike's behavior throughout this throughout the second season as a result of what happened in season 1, and the fact that he is struggling with a lot of stuff, and it's manifesting in these not so great ways. Like, I understand also that he's kind of like, I just want something to be normal, and and that frustration of feeling like this sort of sacred thing's been invaded. I'm not saying it justifies his treatment of Max, but it does, I do get it. He confides in Will, who's like, I don't see a problem with it. Like, he's like, no. And the fact that then Mike walks off on his own and Will is left also on his own, I think ends up being an interesting demonstration of the fact that Will isn't really part of like either of their two groups at that point, because he's still a little bit not quite back in the groove of things. Neither is Mike, but again, having been gone all last season, for obvious reasons, I think that that's part of what's happening here, and it's a nice way to show that in the blocking. And it also very organically sets up for him being by himself so that the other kids can come up and scare him and he can get knocked down into another episode. And we hear that creeping sound again, which links it to the Upside Down pretty directly. He calls out for Mike, and weirdly, this actually gave me very strong vibes, not so much of like 11 calling out for Mike, but rather Barb calling out for Nancy. Here it kind of makes sense, because Mike was the last person he saw. Like, he's closer, I guess. But it makes me sad that then later in their conversation one-on-one between Mike and Will, when he's describing that feeling of being like caught between two slides in a Viewmaster, and he says, don't tell the others. Yet another heartbreaking moment. Like, that really, really makes me sad that Will doesn't feel like Lucas and Dustin would be able to take part in helping with this. And the reason that I think that that's really sad is because we got to watch them all last season be like, especially Lucas, like to be like, we have to, he was willing to throw 11 over because he's like, we have to find Will. And they all love Will. And it, like, I'm not saying Will is wrong, for feeling that way, but it does just make me sad that, like, but buddy, they would totally be on board, like they'd totally be there to help you with this. But in this episode that he has on Halloween night, we see the Mind Flayer properly for the first time, and it chases him down the street, and he takes cover. I remember thinking, Will is totally screwed. I don't know how he's going to get out of this. And then Mike finds him. And once more, for the people in the back, Mike is the one who noticed Will was missing, despite his own angst, because that's the kind of person that Mike is. And when Max asks what's wrong with Will, that is a really deceptively difficult line, I think. And maybe I'm the only one who sees it that way or hears it that way, but the fact that she's able to ask that question without it sounding like overly gossipy or like morbidly curious, and yet also not like overly concerned, like what's wrong, because she wouldn't have a particular connection to Will at this point. She of all the guys, she hasn't really interacted with him much, at all. The fact that she's able to ride that balance is just very nicely done. I love the tone shift here. Even after, right after she asks that question, all you need is one shot, one look between Lucas and Dustin, and they know something much more serious is going on. This is when Jonathan arrives at the Halloween party, and he is looking very much the way that I usually look when I arrive at parties, or at least the way I did during the before times. And Jonathan is greeted by Samantha, who is dressed as Susie Sue from Susie and the Banshees. And Samantha here is played by Shay Jones. I thought she was cool. Like, I liked her interaction with Jonathan. I was like, I would not be mad if you showed up again. And Jonathan and Samantha shake hands, which seemed oddly formal, even for high school kids in the 80s, but But we cut from this short-lived meet cute between Jonathan and Samantha to the escalating, or I should say devolving, relationship between Nancy and Steve, where they get into the fight at the punch bowl and then end up in the bathroom. Mostly, I'm impressed with the fact that this isn't just a step and repeat of the scene in the library, because in a lot of ways it's treading exactly the same territory, and yet not just the performance, but the writing too. It is an escalation, driven primarily by Nancy, and Steve is being dismissive at first, like, I told you not to keep drinking, but then as she gets more serious, he just kind of stops. It's handheld, so it's shakier, and some of that may have been necessity because that is a really small room. It adds to this feeling of like it's not as controlled, it's not as elegant, it's more raw. Nancy is slightly wilder, she's less restrained, and yet Steve is more restrained and more stoic. And of course, Steve just looks absolutely devastated. She's in turmoil. He's crushed. And so much of this comes back to the fact that I think they're both struggling with so much more than just their relationship. And yet it's all tangled up together, so it gets all intertwined, and it just results in this really devastating moment, I think, between the two of them. I'll also just add here that I never interpreted her line of "it's bullshit and you're bullshit" as necessarily her not being in love with him, especially when he asks, "You don't love me," and that's her direct response to that question. I always interpreted that as being not so much "I don't love you," but that whether I love you or not is irrelevant. It's immaterial compared to all these other things that matter so much more. Obviously, that turns out to not be true, because Murray says later, but we don't love Steve. And she can't say it to him in the alley later. So clearly that's not accurate, but personally, I still prefer that idea. And one last note, I kind of feel like that the mess, the spilling of the punch all over her top, ends up feeling a bit like a metaphor for their whole circumstance, their whole situation. And maybe it's really obvious and I'm like the 207th person to notice it, but it's this idea that there's this mess, and Nancy's just like, no, I can't ignore this. There's this mess that's been made and I want to get rid of it. And Steve just leaves, bumps into Jonathan on the way out, but he just walks out. As much credit as I start to give Steve in these early episodes, not for that. It's really pretty messed up that he just abandons her there. Like, regardless of what had just happened, it's not okay. I used to conflate his line later about, I just assumed Jonathan would take you, as referencing this, that he just assumed Jonathan would take her home. And even then, I always kind of questioned, like, but did you though? And no, upon rewatching this episode, it appears that he's actually saying that in regards to taking her to school the next morning, which has a whole other level of implication behind that. So no, like, I don't think he thought about her at all in terms of how she might get home that night. However, Jonathan says in chapter 3 that Steve asked him, when are we supposed to infer that took place? And to completely contradict myself yet again, I'll also say that, like, it makes sense in a way. I guess I don't like it, but it does make sense that he doesn't just, like, change overnight, that, like, this is still vestiges of kind of the person that we saw last season. I mean, this isn't as bad as the vandalism stuff, but it's still yikes. This is when we get the scene of Will and Mike back at the Wheelers' house in the basement, and them confiding in each other, because I also wonder here if this is implying that Mike doesn't really talk to the other boys about 11 either, and what he's going through. I mean, I think it's easy to infer that just based on how much trouble he seems to be in and what he's struggling with. But again, I kind of bums me out that he doesn't feel, if that's the case, that he doesn't feel that he can talk to his other two friends about it. I mean, I'm glad that Will is there, and I'm glad that Mike is there for Will, but I don't know, it just... And maybe that's how it is sometimes. Like, we don't turn to our friends when we should. I don't know. Maybe. Jonathan does take Nancy home and puts her to bed. Of course, I'm left to wonder, how do they get past Karen and Ted? I mean, the lights are on in the living room, dude. Probably not supposed to worry about it, but I noticed. Everyone is returning home, because that's when we finally catch up with Hopper returning to the cabin. She almost doesn't let him in at first, but she has dragged the TV into her bedroom. And he apologizes, and he calls her by her name, which, I noted that, and I kind of said, is this the first time we've heard Hopper call her by her name? And I think it might be. It's one of the earliest occasions, if it's not the first. And it just was kind of like, oh. Meanwhile, Elle goes into the astral plane to find Mike. This is some high-quality romantic pining going on here. I like everything about this. The almost essentially eye contact between them again, to kind of piggyback off of the beginning, and he doesn't actually see her and walks away, and it's just, I have no idea if this scene is good or not. I'll just be honest. But I love it. Not to mention, it's a huge step up from season 1 in terms of her powers and what she was able to do. I mean, she doesn't need the tank. All she needs is the static and the blindfold, which is like a nice implication that she's been practicing. And in our final scene of the episode, Dustin also returns home, and we hear the creeping sound, which is very foreboding, and finds something in the trash can. And he pulls down the particle thrower of part of the costume, of the Ghostbusters costume, which is just adorable. I also love his continuous repetition of shit, 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 because that feels very continuous and consistent with his character. It's very much become a Dustinism, I think, and I like that. And it does make me wonder, was this something Matarazzo came up with, or was that a Duffer's direction thing, And we end on this weird hard cut on the, like, almost censored cut of holy shit. And I'm like, why? We just heard him say shit, shit, shit. I mean, it's cute, it works, but it feels slightly out of place, but it's still fun and smashed into the Ghostbusters theme. And that's the end of the episode. So final thoughts. This episode really brings home what it is I like about these early episodes of season 2. We get to have conflict, and we get to have things like character development, and we get to spend time in this world without world-ending level stakes. We get to kind of just hang out with the characters and spend some time with them as they develop a little bit. It doesn't drag. I don't think it drags, but it allows us to kind of really catch up with where they are emotionally after a year's time, settle into the new normal, to borrow a all too familiar term now, what their lives look like and how they're different, because there has been a year's worth of time elapsed. So I really like a second installment that takes the time to do that. And I think season 2 of Stranger Things is a great example of how to do that well. Even though my experience of high school was nothing like the Hawkins high teenagers, it's still, they're the ones I feel like I relate to the most. That being said, I really do like, as uncomfortable it is as it is to watch, and as sad as it is, the scenes between Nancy and Steve in this episode are really, really good. These arguments and these disagreements and this fallout, this falling apart between them was necessary and important for them as people. Sometimes things are sticky and they're messy, but it's necessary to get to a better place. And that's encouraging in the long run. It would be cool to see them form a friendship. Partly why I want to see more of them together, more of them interacting in a subsequent season. I don't think that it's likely, but it would be cool. I'm still gonna hope for it, even if it's unlikely. I also really dig all the vibes with Max. I know a lot of people view it as very like teen angsty, and it's a little too much drama, but I really enjoy it. I like that it isn't overplayed. It doesn't feel too heavy-handed. It feels very believable for kids at that age, at least through a Hollywood-ish lens. And this balance that Lucas and Dustin specifically have to kind of ride in terms of wanting to get closer to her, but then also knowing like how delicate a lot of this information is. They all feel part of the same whole. They all feel part of the same story, and that doesn't always happen, even in this show. And I think in the end, all of this sort of balancing and, trying to negotiate friendships and new friendship dynamics and everything, it feels like a continuation of what we talked about in season 1 of, the value of these formative friendships and these relationships, and how when something changes, it's no one's fault, but it can feel like it's someone's fault, and that's what creates the conflict. And it just feels like a nice natural progression of that. And I really like both how it plays out here and also where it goes. So that's going to conclude the contemplation on Chapter 2, Trick or Treat Freak. If you've got comments, questions, or thoughts, you can join the conversation over on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. Links will be in the show notes. And if you've been enjoying this podcast, then please consider leaving a review. Coffee and Contemplation is available on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, anywhere podcasts are sold for free. So thanks for listening, and see you next time. Over and out. Oh, it's not what I wrote down at all. We're almost done. They're the ones I feel like I can relate to the most. And we're done.